She stood in front of everyone holding a glass of wine like she was toasting something. Then, with a smirk, she said, "And this is a Lara." The mistake my son got stuck with. Laughter rolled through the room. Not loud, just enough to sting. An uncle chuckled. A cousin bit her lip, trying not to smile. And I stood there, frozen, gripping my son's hand. I could feel my face flush. I looked down at Callum, hoping he hadn't heard. But he had. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but something older. Something steady. Then, quietly, he pulled on my arm and said, "Can I show everyone what Dad wrote in his letter before he left?" He didn't wait for me to answer. He stepped forward, clutching a folded piece of paper he always kept in his backpack. The same letter his dad had written before the accident, a letter none of them had seen. And in that moment, the laughter stopped. I sat in the car outside Judith's house with my hands locked around the steering wheel, trying to calm the tight ache in my chest. Callum sat in the back seat, swinging his legs and humming a song he'd made up. He had no idea how heavy today felt for me, and I was glad. He didn't need to carry any of this. It had been a year since Kieran died. A full year of trying to breathe through grief while raising the one piece of him I had left. Callum had just turned 6 last month. He looked more like Kieran every day, the same eyes, the same smile, and lately, the same habit of holding in his emotions until they spilled out in the quietest, most unexpected ways. Judith, Kieran's mother, had invited us to the family gathering 2 weeks ago through a brief text message. No warmth, no explanation, just a time, date, and the words, "For Callum's sake." I knew what it meant. It meant I wasn't really welcome, but the little boy sitting behind me was. I stared at that message for an hour before responding, finally typing, "Will be there," with shaking hands. Kieran and I weren't married. We weren't even together when he died. Our relationship had been complicated. We loved each other once, maybe too hard and too fast, but it never settled into something healthy. We broke up 4 months before his accident. That time, it felt final. Still, we stayed connected for Callum. He came over, called every night, showed up for school plays and bedtime stories. I never kept him away from his son, even when things between us felt like splinters under the skin. Judith never forgave me for taking Kieran away from what she thought his life should have looked like. She hated that I wasn't from the same background, that I didn't come from money, that I didn't attend the college she bragged about in every conversation. From the beginning, she made it clear I didn't measure up. At first, I tried to prove her wrong. Then I gave up trying and focused on Callum. She barely spoke to me at the funeral. I didn't expect more now. I looked at myself in the mirror. Simple black dress, clean makeup, hair tied back. I looked fine. Nothing fancy, but respectful, presentable. I glanced at Callum's shirt, blue with a small dinosaur in the corner. He'd picked it himself and said it made him feel brave. I took one last breath, unclipped my seatbelt, and stepped out of the car. The driveway was already lined with vehicles. People I hadn't seen in years or had only met once would be inside. Kieran's cousins, his aunts and uncles, his older brother Mark, who mostly kept to himself but always smiled at Callum. Rosa, Judith's sister, would be there too. She was the only one who ever treated me like a human being, once even calling to check on me after the funeral. Her voice had cracked when she said, "He loved you in ways he didn't know how to show." Callum held my hand as we walked to the door. Before I knocked, he squeezed my fingers. "You okay, Mommy?" he asked. I smiled and nodded even though my chest was burning. "I'm okay, baby." Judith answered the door. Her eyes flicked to me, then dropped to Callum. Her mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. She stepped aside without saying a word. The house looked almost exactly as I remembered. Too clean, too cold. Framed pictures of Kieran and Mark lined the hallway. Not one of them included Callum. Not one of them included me. Inside, voices rose and fell in polite laughter. I saw the dining table covered in dishes, glasses clinking, people shifting from room to room with napkins and wine in their hands. It looked like any normal family gathering from the outside, but I knew better. I could already feel the tension building beneath the surface, like a wire pulled tight and waiting to snap. Mark gave a small wave when he saw me. Rosa came over and gave Callum a quick hug, then squeezed my shoulder. "You're doing good," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I nodded, holding the smile on my face like armor. I just had to get through a couple of hours. For Callum. He needed to know he belonged, even if I didn't. I didn't know then that everything would change before dessert, that my son, the quietest one in the room, would be the one to speak the loudest truth, that by the time we walked out of that house, nothing would feel the same. The living room buzzed with conversation, the kind that only exists at family events where people drink just enough to pretend they like each other. Judith had placed everyone into perfect controlled positions, Rosa near the fireplace, Mark by the drinks, and me in the corner, like furniture she couldn't move but didn't want to look at. Callum sat quietly next to me, swinging his legs against the couch. He had a coloring book, but his eyes kept flicking up, watching the people moving around us. He was taking it all in, the way kids do when adults think they aren't paying attention. Judith called everyone to gather in the living room just before dinner. She raised her glass and started her usual performance, the kind I had seen before at Kieran's birthday dinners and holiday parties, smiling too wide, pausing just long enough for the room to quiet. People respected her because she made it clear they should. "I want to thank everyone for coming," she said, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "It means a lot to keep this family close, even with all the change we've been through." There was a murmur of agreement. Someone clinked a glass. A cousin nodded along like they'd been waiting for the cue. Judith went down a short list of family members. A new baby, a college acceptance, Mark's recent job promotion. People cheered and clapped. Then finally, she turned toward where Callum and I sat. "And of course," she said, her tone shifting like a blade sliding into place, "we have Alara with us, the mistake my son got stuck with." The words landed like glass shattering. It took a second for me to process what she had just said. My mind fumbled for another meaning, something else she could have meant, but she looked right at me as she said it, her face calm, her mouth curled in the corner like she'd finally said what she'd always wanted to. There was a pause. Then a few people chuckled. One of the uncles laughed under his breath. Mark looked at the floor. Rosa's face fell, but she didn't speak. It wasn't just what Judith had said, it was how easy the room accepted it. I felt the sting spread across my face. I could hear the blood in my ears, the same sound I'd heard once when I was 15 and locked myself in the school bathroom after a group of girls laughed at my thrift store shoes. It was the same shame, only now I was older and holding my son's hand. Callum looked up at me, confused. "Mommy," he whispered. "What did she mean?" I opened my mouth, but I couldn't speak. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and gently pulled Callum with me. My hand trembled as I reached for the coat on the back of the chair. I wasn't going to cry in front of them. I wasn't going to give Judith that. I just needed to leave. But then I felt Callum stop walking. He tugged his hand from mine, turned around, and walked toward the front of the room. I froze. I almost called his name, but something about the way he stood there, small, still, steady, made me stop. He reached into the side pocket of his backpack and pulled out a folded, creased piece of paper. His little fingers smoothed it out carefully. Then he looked up at the room. "I want to read something," he said. The conversation stopped. No one laughed. Judith blinked, visibly thrown off by the sudden attention being pulled away from her. "This is a letter my dad wrote to me before he died," Callum said. "But he said it was for my mom, too." I stepped forward, trying to stop him, but he held up his hand without looking at me. "I want to read it," he said again, louder this time. Judith crossed her arms. Someone near the kitchen cleared their throat. No one dared interrupt. All eyes were on my 6-year-old son, standing in front of people who had never truly seen him or me as part of their family. I didn't know what was in the letter. Kieran had written it after one of our final conversations, and though Callum had shown me parts of it before, I had never heard it all aloud. Especially not like this. Especially not here. And then Callum began to read. Callum stood at the front of the room, his hands gripping the letter like it was made of glass. His shoulders were square, but I could see the way his chest moved, fast, unsteady, brave. He cleared his throat and began to read. "To my son Callum," he said, his voice soft but clear. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not with you anymore." The room went quiet. Not the kind of silence that happens when people are being polite. This one was thick. It sat in the air and made people sit straighter. "I'm sorry I can't be there to teach you how to ride a bike or talk to girls or take care of your mom the way she deserves. I hope you know I loved you from the second I knew you existed." I watched Judith's arms slowly drop to her sides. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper. Mark leaned against the doorframe and looked at the floor. No one moved. "I know you'll hear stories about me, some of them true, some not. But there's one thing I need you to always remember. Your mom, Ilara." Callum's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "She is the best thing I ever did. I made a lot of mistakes, but loving her was never one of them. I didn't always treat her right. I didn't always listen when I should have. But she stood by me when no one else would. She gave me a home when I didn't know how to build one. She gave you to me." My heart ached in my chest. I hadn't heard those words before. Kieran must have written this alone, in one of those moments he never talked about. Quiet and honest, the kind that didn't come easy to him. "If you ever forget who your mom is," Callum continued, "just remember she carried us both when I couldn't stand on my own. You're going to be strong because she taught you how. And I hope one day, when someone tries to tell you she wasn't enough, you remember this letter and speak louder than I ever could." The room stayed still. No one laughed. No one dared. Callum looked up. He folded the letter, walked over to me, and slipped his hand into mine. Then he turned back to Judith. "You said she was a mistake," he said, his voice steady now. "But my dad didn't think so." "I don't think so." Judith opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her cheeks had gone pale. I couldn't tell if it was shock, shame, or just the weight of being challenged by the one person she thought wouldn't fight back. Mark finally stepped forward. His voice was quiet but firm. "I remember when Kieran gave that letter to me," he said. "He told me to give it to Callum if anything happened. I forgot about it after the funeral. I never read it, but now I wish I had." He looked at me for the first time that night. He meant it. Rosa stepped closer, placing her hand gently on Callum's head. She looked across the room and spoke without raising her voice. "This child just reminded all of us what love looks like. And maybe it didn't come the way some of us wanted, but that doesn't make it less real." I couldn't speak. My throat burned. My knees felt weak, but I stayed standing because Callum hadn't let go of my hand. Judith stared at us, her mouth tight, but she didn't say another word. The control she always carried had slipped through her fingers. This time, she had no room to rewrite the story. Rosa turned to me. "You don't have to leave," she said, "but if you do, just know that some of us are listening now." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. Callum looked up at me and smiled, like he'd just done the most ordinary thing in the world. He didn't realize the room he'd changed, the weight he'd lifted, the truth he'd spoken when the rest of us had fallen silent for too long. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a gathering anymore. It was a line drawn in sand. It was the moment we stopped being quiet, the moment we stood up, not with rage, but with truth. Callum's words lingered in the air like smoke from a fire nobody saw coming. No one moved. No one picked up their wine glass. It was like the entire room forgot how to function for a moment, the kind of silence that comes after something sacred is said out loud. I stood next to my son, my hand still wrapped around his. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had slowed, not because I was calm, but because something deeper had taken hold. The kind of stillness that comes when you realize the worst already happened and you're still standing. Judith's face had hardened. Her lips were tight, her eyes darting between me, Callum, and the letter that now sat folded neatly in my son's small hands. She had been stripped of her usual composure. Her power wasn't gone, but it had been cracked. She took a slow breath and tried to recover. "That letter doesn't change the facts," she said, her voice quieter than before. "My son was confused. He didn't know what he was saying." "He knew exactly what he was saying," Mark interrupted. His voice wasn't angry, but it didn't need to be. He stepped fully into the room now, his hands in his pockets. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak directly to his mother that way. "You never liked Ilara. You made that clear when Kieran was alive. But I was there, remember? When they fought, when they tried to make it work, when he cried in the garage after they broke up. He was a mess, but it wasn't her fault. And when he finally started writing things down, he asked me to make sure this letter got to Callum. He wanted to be heard." Judith looked at her son, stunned. "He was going to propose," Mark said. "He told me that a week before the accident. He was saving up for a ring. He just hadn't figured out how to fix what was broken between them. My breath caught. That was something I hadn't known. I stared at Mark, searching his face for anything that told me he was just saying it to soften the blow of everything else. But he didn't blink. He just nodded once as if to say, "Yes, this is real." "I found a note in his glove box," Mark added. He was planning something. It wasn't just guilt. He loved her. He wanted this family to stop treating her like a stain we couldn't wash off. Rosa stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "He told me too," she said softly. "After the two of you broke up, he came to my house, sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about how he never really knew what it meant to be loved until you came along. He was scared of being like his father, scared he'd mess it up." I looked down at Callum. He was quiet again, leaning against my leg. I ran my hand gently through his hair, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. I looked back at Judith. She said nothing. Her eyes had lost the edge. She looked at Callum like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, not as her son's child, not as a reminder of something she disapproved of, but as a boy who had just stood in front of a room full of adults and shown more grace than any of them. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice tight, brittle. "That wasn't how I meant it. I was angry." It wasn't a real apology. It wasn't even close. But I didn't need it. I didn't come here for her approval. I came because my son deserved to know he belonged. And he had just done what I never could. He had held up the truth like a shield and dared them to look at it. I nodded once and spoke clearly. "We're going now." Mark stepped aside to make space. Rosa squeezed my arm. Callum waved at Rosa, then turned back to the room one last time. "My dad loved her," he said. "And I do too." That was it. No anger, no screaming, just a quiet statement that hit harder than anything I could have planned. And then we walked out, not defeated but whole. The kind of whole that doesn't need permission to exist. The sky was just starting to turn pink as we walked back to the car. I unlocked the door, and Callum climbed into his booster seat without a word. I buckled him in, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, and kissed the top of his head. He looked up at me and smiled. "Did I do okay?" he asked. I sat there for a moment, searching for the right answer. I didn't want to just say yes. I wanted him to understand what he had done. "You did more than okay," I said. "You told the truth when it mattered most." He nodded like he understood, like he knew the weight of what had just happened. Pulled the letter from his pocket and held it carefully in his lap. As I drove, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was calm. We didn't need to talk right away. We just needed to breathe. That night, after I tucked him in and watched him fall asleep clutching his stuffed dinosaur, I sat alone in the kitchen with the letter unfolded in front of me. I read every word again, slowly this time. I let the tears fall, not from pain, but from something else, something like release. For years, I had carried the weight of being unwanted by the people closest to the man I once loved. I had tried to be quiet, to be polite, to keep peace in rooms that were never built for me. I kept hoping that if I was careful enough, kind enough, I'd earn their respect. I never did. It took a 6-year-old boy with his father's handwriting in his hands to remind me that I never needed their permission to exist in that family. Kieran had already written it into truth. Callum had spoken it into fact. Judith's words had wounded me, but they no longer defined me. What mattered more was what my son had shown me, that truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be steady. That strength isn't always in the confrontation, it's in the clarity to walk away knowing who you are. And I knew now. I was not the mistake Kieran got stuck with. I was the woman he loved when he was too broken to say it out loud. I was the mother of the boy who stood in a room full of people and defended the person who raised him, loved him, protected him. I didn't need to go back and demand an apology. I didn't need Judith to rewrite what she thought of me. Her opinion could no longer reach me. That house, those people, that moment, they were no longer holding me hostage. The next morning, I made pancakes. Callum asked for chocolate chips in his, and I let him pour them in himself. We ate at the kitchen table with music playing and the window cracked open just enough to let the breeze through. It felt like the beginning of something better. Later that week, Rosa called. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer advice. She just said, "I'm proud of him. And of you." That was enough. Mark sent a short message, just a single sentence. He would have been proud too. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The story had already spoken. Callum asked if he could frame the letter. We bought a simple wooden frame that weekend and hung it above his bed. It wasn't for decoration. It was a reminder, a proof of love, written in ink and sealed by the voice of a boy who knew what it meant. Now when people ask about his father, Callum doesn't hesitate. He says he loved me, and he loved my mom. That's what I carry forward. Not the silence, not the shame, just the truth, spoken clearly in a room that tried to forget what real love looked like. And this time, we didn't just survive it, we rose. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, if you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, or if someone you love ever stood up for you when you couldn't find the words, I hope you remember this. You are not a mistake. You are not less than. And sometimes, the quietest voice can be the one that finally breaks the silence. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own experience with moments like this. And if you want more real stories about love, loss, healing, and the strength it takes to keep going, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. This is Alara's story, but it could be any of ours.